Cowboy purchased a ghosted village for $150, but found a family living among the ruins. Jake Miller had expected nothing more than weathered timber and broken dreams when he'd counted out those silver dollars 3 days prior. The land agent's tobacco-stained fingers snatching up the money with unseemly haste. The man had called it Copper Ridge Mining Camp, though Jake suspected it hadn't seen copper or much of anything else in years. What drew him wasn't sentiment, but practicality. Abandoned camps sometimes held forgotten silver veins, and a man with more determination than capital could carve out a living from what others left behind. The morning sun cast long shadows across the valley as Jake guided his mare through the narrow canyon approach, expecting to find the hollow shells of buildings surrendered to wind and time. Instead, the acrid scent of wood smoke drifted down from the ridge, and his horse's ears pricked forward at sounds that shouldn't exist in a dead place. The rhythmic thunk of an axe splitting kindling, the distant clatter of tin against wood. His chest tightened with a mixture of curiosity and caution. Either squatters had taken residence, or the land agent had sold him something that wasn't entirely his to sell. The first building came into view as he rounded a cluster of pine trees, and Jake's breath caught in his throat. The old assay office stood with purpose rather than decay, its roof patched with fresh timber and a thin column of smoke rising straight up in the still air. Autumn sunlight gleamed off glass windows that should have been broken, and a small garden plot stretched along the building's southern exposure. Rows of late vegetables defying the approaching October frost. Someone had built a life here among the supposed ruins. Jake dismounted slowly, his boots crunching on scattered pine needles as he approached what he'd been told was his property. The sound of his footsteps must have carried, because the front door opened with deliberate care. A woman emerged, and Jake's hand instinctively moved away from his sidearm as he took in the sight of a double-barreled shotgun pointed directly at his chest. She held it with the steady confidence of someone who'd fired it before, and would again without hesitation. "That's far enough, mister," the woman said, her voice carrying the flat authority of someone who'd learned to stand her ground against unwelcome visitors. She appeared to be in her 50s, with steel-gray hair pulled back in a practical bun and clothes that spoke of hard work rather than poverty, patched but clean, mended with care. Her eyes never wavered from his face, reading his intentions with the sharp attention of a hawk watching for movement in tall grass. "Ma'am," Jake said carefully, raising his hands to show they were empty, "I don't mean any harm. Name's Jake Miller, and I've got a deed that says I own this land." He reached slowly toward his shirt pocket, stopping when the shotgun barrel shifted slightly. "May I show you the papers?" The woman's jaw tightened, but she nodded once. Jake withdrew the folded document, holding it out at arm's length. She approached close enough to see it clearly without lowering her weapon, her eyes scanning the official seals and signatures that meant everything and nothing depending on who held the bigger gun. "Lucy Barnes," she said finally, though the shotgun remained steady. "This is my granddaughter Lily and my home. Deed or no deed. We've been here 4 months, and we're not leaving." Her voice carried a weariness that spoke of battles fought and lost, but also a determination that suggested she'd found something worth fighting for in this place. From inside the building came a small, weak cough, followed by a child's voice calling out in a thread of sound that barely carried through the doorway. Lucy's composure cracked for just an instant, maternal concern flickering across her features before the steel returned to her spine. "Your granddaughter's sick," Jake observed, lowering his hands slowly. The pieces were beginning to form a picture he hadn't expected. Not squatters looking for easy shelter, but a family that had run out of other options. "She's resting," Lucy said curtly, but Jake caught the way her knuckles whitened around the shotgun's stock. "Whatever business you think you have here, it can wait until she's better." Jake studied the woman's face, seeing past the defiance to the exhaustion underneath. 4 months of standing guard, 4 months of nursing a sick child in isolation, 4 months of wondering when the next threat would come walking up the canyon. He'd come here looking for silver in the ground, but what he'd found was something more complicated. A family that had turned ruins into sanctuary. and a child whose welfare now hung in the balance of decisions made by adults who'd never meant for their paths to cross. The October wind stirred the pine boughs overhead, sending shadows dancing across the camp, and Jake realized that his $150 had bought him more than he'd bargained for. The question now was what he intended to do about it. Jake spent the next hour learning that Lily Barnes possessed a gift that had made her family both blessed and cursed. The child lay on a narrow cot inside the converted assay office, her 8-year-old frame appearing even smaller beneath the carefully mended quilts that Lucy had tucked around her. When Jake finally gained permission to enter, after demonstrating his peaceful intentions by helping Lucy carry water from a hidden spring he hadn't known existed, he found himself looking down at a pale, serious face dominated by unusually bright green eyes that seemed to see more than they should. "She can find Silver," Lucy said quietly, settling into a chair beside the cot with the weary grace of someone who'd kept vigil for too many nights. "Not just silver, any precious metal buried in the earth. Started when she turned 7, right after her parents died in that influenza outbreak down in Millerville. At first we thought it was just a child's imagination, the way she'd get headaches walking over certain ground, but then we tested it." Lucy's voice carried a mixture of pride and regret that spoke of discoveries that had brought more trouble than treasure. Lily's small hand emerged from beneath the quilts, pointing toward the far corner of the room where Jake could see nothing but stone foundation and wooden floorboards. "There's silver there," she whispered, her voice barely audible but carrying absolute certainty. "Goes deep, like tree roots. Makes my head hurt when I think about it too long." She closed her eyes, and Jake watched her face contort slightly, as if the mere mention of her ability caused physical pain. Lucy reached out to smooth the child's hair with gentle fingers that trembled slightly. "The headaches got worse after we lost the homestead. Men came with papers saying my late husband owed money for railroad expansion work he never did, claimed we had to pay $1,200 or forfeit the land. When they heard about Lily's gift," she paused, her jaw tightening with remembered anger. "They wanted to take her, said a child who could find silver would be valuable to the right people. That's when we ran." Jake knelt beside the cot, studying the child's pale features and seeing something that reminded him of his own younger sister, lost to fever years ago. "How long has she been like this?" he asked, noting the dark circles under Lily's eyes and the way her breathing seemed labored. 3 weeks, getting worse. But the sickness started right after we settled here," Lucy replied, rising to check a pot of herbal tea simmering on the small wood stove. "It's like her gift is fighting against something in this place. She says the silver calls to her, but it hurts to listen. I've tried every remedy I know. Willow bark for the pain, chamomile for sleep, even some tribal medicines an old Shoshone woman taught me years ago. Nothing seems to help for long." Jake watched as Lucy poured the tea into a tin cup, her movements efficient but weighted with exhaustion. 4 months of running, 4 months of hiding, 4 months of watching a sick child grow sicker while fighting off anyone who might discover their secret. The woman had turned an abandoned mining camp into a fortress of solitude, but solitude couldn't cure whatever was slowly stealing the life from her granddaughter. "The men who came after you?" Jake said carefully. "What did they look like? What names did they give?" Something in Lucy's description of fraudulent railroad debts struck him as familiar, though he couldn't yet place why. Lucy's eyes sharpened with suspicion, but something in Jake's tone must have convinced her of his sincerity. "Led by a deputy named Hayes, though I never saw any real badge. Tall man with dead eyes and a way of talking that made legal theft sound like kindness. Said he represented the Riverside Railroad Company. Claimed they had documentation proving my husband had signed contracts for survey work before he died." She handed the tea to Lily, supporting the child's head as she took small, careful sips. "But Samuel never worked for any railroad. He was a blacksmith. Never left our valley except to trade in the nearest town." Jake felt something cold settle in his stomach as the pieces began to form a pattern he didn't like. The hasty sale of the mining camp, the land agent's eagerness to take his money, and now a family driven from their home by railroad men with questionable documents. His $150 might have bought him more than worthless mining claims. It might have made him an unwitting participant in something much darker than simple land speculation. The sound of approaching horses reached them 3 days later, just as Jake had begun to hope that whatever forces had driven the Barnes family into hiding might have lost their trail. He'd spent those days helping Lucy tend to Lily, whose condition seemed to fluctuate with mysterious rhythms, better in the early morning when mist hung over the canyon, worse when the afternoon sun beat down on the silver-rich rock formations that surrounded their hidden sanctuary. Jake had also begun to understand why Lucy had chosen this particular building for their refuge. The old assay office sat at the convergence of 3 canyon walls, with only one easily defended approach and multiple escape routes through narrow passages that larger groups couldn't navigate. Lucy's grip tightened on the shotgun as the hoofbeats grew closer, her weathered hands finding the familiar weight of the weapon with practiced ease. 5 riders, she said quietly, pressing her ear to the doorframe. Maybe 6, moving too slow to be friendly visitors. Through the single window, Jake could see dust rising above the pine trees that marked the canyon's entrance, and he felt his own hand drift toward the Colt at his hip. The riders emerged from the tree line with the deliberate confidence of men who expected no resistance. Deputy Tom Hayes rode at the front, his badge catching the afternoon sunlight, but Jake's attention was drawn to the 4 men flanking him, hired guns with the kind of cold professionalism that suggested they'd done this work before. Hayes himself was a tall, lean man with prematurely gray hair and eyes the color of winter ice, wearing a deputy's star that looked official enough to fool most people who didn't examine it too closely. "Mrs. Barnes," Hayes called out as his group approached the assay office, his voice carrying the false courtesy of a man conducting distasteful but necessary business. "I know you're in there, and I know you have the child with you. Time to settle your debts like civilized people." He remained mounted, letting his elevated position emphasize the authority he claimed to represent, while his hired men spread out in a loose semicircle that blocked the most obvious escape routes. Lucy stepped out to meet them, the shotgun held at her side but clearly visible, her posture radiating the kind of quiet defiance that suggested she'd rather die fighting than surrender without one. "My family doesn't owe anyone anything, Deputy," she said, putting enough emphasis on his title to make it clear she questioned its legitimacy. "We paid our debts when we lost everything to your railroad friends' lies." Hayes dismounted with calculated slowness, reaching into his coat to withdraw a leather portfolio thick with official-looking documents. "Mrs. Barnes, your late husband Samuel signed contracts with the Riverside Railroad Company for survey work along the proposed northern expansion route. Total value of $1,200, with payment due upon completion of services. Since Mr. Barnes died before fulfilling his obligations, that debt transfers to his estate, which means you." He approached close enough to hand her the papers, though Jake noticed he stayed well clear of the shotgun's effective range. Jake stepped out of the building behind Lucy, his presence causing an immediate shift in the dynamics of the confrontation. Hayes's eyes narrowed as he took in this unexpected variable, and Jake could see the deputy's mind working to categorize him: ally, threat, or merely inconvenient witness. "And you are?" Hayes asked, his tone shifting to include a warning that Jake would be wise to identify himself quickly and accurately. "Jake Miller. I own this land now." Jake produced his deed, holding it up so Hayes could see the official seals that matched the deputy's own paperwork. "Bought it fair and square 3 days ago. These folks are my guests." Something flickered across Hayes's face: surprise, calculation, and what might have been satisfaction. "Mr. Miller, I'm afraid you've been the victim of a fraudulent sale. This land is subject to railroad seizure for unpaid debts. Your deed won't be worth the paper it's printed on once we settle Mrs. Barnes's obligations." Hayes signaled to one of his men, who produced another set of documents from his saddlebags. "However, the Riverside Railroad Company is prepared to offer you compensation for your inconvenience. $200 for a property you paid $150 for, a fair profit for 3 days' ownership." Jake examined the papers Hayes offered, noting inconsistencies in the dates and signatures that suggested hasty forgery. More troubling was the way Hayes seemed to know exactly how much Jake had paid for the property. Information that should have been private between Jake and the land agent. Seems mighty convenient that you know my business so well, Deputy. Almost like this whole transaction was planned out in advance. Hayes's smile never reached his eyes. The Riverside Railroad Company maintains extensive records, Mr. Miller. We're in the business of expanding civilization across this territory, which sometimes requires coordination with local land sales. He gestured toward Lucy and the building behind her. Mrs. Barnes and her granddaughter will accompany me to our regional headquarters, where they'll work off the debt through domestic service in our company camps. The child will be well cared for, I assure you. Lucy's knuckles went white around the shotgun. I'd rather burn this place down with all of us in it than let you take Lily. That won't be necessary, Hayes said smoothly. The child has unique talents that would be wasted in such a dramatic gesture. The Riverside Railroad Company has need of individuals who can locate mineral deposits efficiently. Young Lily could help us avoid expensive and time-consuming survey work, saving the company thousands of dollars while working off her family's debt. The truth hit Jake like a physical blow. Hayes knew about Lily's gift, had known all along. The fraudulent debt, the convenient land sale, the systematic pressure on the Barnes family, all of it designed to acquire a child whose supernatural abilities could locate silver deposits across the territory. Jake's deed wasn't just worthless. It was part of a carefully orchestrated trap that he'd walked into with his eyes wide open and his pockets full of silver. How many other families? Jake asked quietly, his voice carrying a dangerous edge that made Hayes's hired men shift in their saddles. How many other homesteads have you stolen with fake railroad debts? Hayes tilted his head, as if considering how much truth to reveal. Progress requires sacrifice, Mr. Miller. The territory is rich in resources that can benefit everyone, but only if those resources are developed by people with the vision and capital to do so properly. Small farmers and independent miners lack the organizational capacity for large-scale operations. His gaze shifted to the building where Lily lay hidden. Some individuals possess gifts that transcend their humble circumstances. The Riverside Railroad Company simply helps such people reach their full potential. Jake felt rage building in his chest, but he forced himself to think tactically. 6 armed men against 1 shotgun and his sidearm, with a sick child caught in the middle. Direct confrontation would get them all killed, but surrender would mean handing Lily over to people who viewed her as a resource to be exploited, rather than a child to be protected. I'll need to see documentation proving these debts are legitimate, Jake said carefully. And I'll want to examine the original contracts your company claims my guest's husband signed. Seems only fair, given the amounts involved. Hayes's expression hardened, the veneer of civility slipping to reveal something much colder underneath. Mr. Miller, I'm afraid you're misunderstanding the situation. This isn't a negotiation or a legal proceeding. This is debt collection, and I have the authority to use whatever means necessary to recover what's owed. He nodded to his men, who began dismounting with the practiced efficiency of predators closing in on cornered prey. You can accept our generous offer for the land and walk away, or you can be charged with interfering with legitimate railroad business. Either way, Mrs. Barnes and her granddaughter are coming with us. Jake's hand settled on his gun butt as Lucy raised the shotgun to her shoulder, and in that moment, he understood that his $150 had bought him something much more valuable than mining claims. It had bought him the chance to stand between a child and the people who would steal her childhood for their own profit. Jake's decision crystallized with the cold clarity that comes when a man realizes he's reached the point where backing down means abandoning everything he believes about right and wrong. Nobody's taking anybody anywhere, he said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of finality that made Hayes's hired men pause in their advance. This is my land, and these people are under my protection. Hayes's laugh held no humor, just the bitter sound of a man whose patience had reached its limit. Mr. Miller, you're making a serious mistake. The Riverside Railroad Company has legitimate claims here, backed by federal authority. You're interfering with lawful business operations. Then show me the proof. Jake said, stepping forward despite the odds against him. Show me Samuel Barnes's signature on contracts with dates that make sense. Show me the federal authorization for your debt collection. Show me anything that isn't forged paper and empty threats. He'd spent the previous night examining the documents Hayes had presented, and the inconsistencies were glaring to anyone who looked closely. Wrong ink, mismatched dates, signatures that didn't match the writing samples Lucy had shown him from her husband's genuine correspondence. From inside the assay office came a weak voice that somehow carried more authority than all of Hayes's bluster. "There's a map," Lily called out, her words barely audible but stopping the confrontation cold. "Hidden in the wall where the silver sings loudest. Shows where the veins run deep." Lucy's eyes widened with understanding, and she backed toward the building's entrance while keeping her shotgun trained on Hayes's men. "Jake, there's a loose stone in the back wall, behind where my husband's old tools are stored. Lily kept saying something was hidden there, but I thought it was just her gift acting up." Jake found himself in the impossible position of wanting to investigate Lily's claim while not daring to turn his back on 6 armed men who grew more dangerous with each passing moment. Hayes, however, seemed equally torn between pressing his immediate advantage and learning what the child might have discovered. "Step away from the building, Mrs. Barnes," Hayes ordered, but his voice carried less conviction than before. "Whatever you think you've found doesn't change the legal situation here." Jake made his choice, trusting Lucy to hold the line while he ducked inside the converted assay office. The loose stone Lily had mentioned was exactly where she'd indicated, and behind it, Jake found a rolled survey map that made his blood run cold. The document showed the entire Copper Ridge area in meticulous detail, with mineral veins marked in different colored inks to indicate silver, copper, and trace amounts of gold. The map was signed by Michael Foster, Territory Survey Office, and dated just 2 months ago, weeks after Jake had supposedly bought abandoned mining claims. But it was the notations along the margins that told the real story. Estimated values in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, railway access routes marked for future development, and a list of property owners who would need to be relocated to access the richest deposits. The Barnes homestead was circled in red ink, with notes about special assets and extraction timeline priority 1. Jake emerged from the building with the map in his hands, his face grim with the knowledge of just how deep the conspiracy ran. "This map shows silver veins worth more than most men see in a lifetime," he announced, holding up the document so everyone could see it. "Funny how the land agent forgot to mention that when he was so eager to sell me this worthless mining camp." Hayes's composure finally cracked, his hand dropping to his sidearm as he realized the situation had shifted beyond his control. "That map is stolen railroad property, Mr. Miller. Hand it over immediately, or I'll have you arrested for theft of company documents." "Whose company?" Jake pressed, sensing weakness. "Because this map is signed by a territorial surveyor, not railroad personnel. Makes me wonder who really sent you here, and whether that badge you're wearing gives you any actual authority over anything." Lucy had been examining Jake's deed while the men faced off, and her sharp intake of breath drew everyone's attention. "Jake, this deed, there's a clause about mineral rights. Says whoever controls the surface property has exclusive rights to any precious metals found beneath it." Her voice carried a mixture of amazement and dawning understanding. "If this survey map is accurate, your $150 just bought you a fortune in silver." The revelation hit Hayes like a physical blow. His carefully orchestrated plan to acquire a child with supernatural abilities and the land she could help exploit had just collapsed into legal complications that even fraudulent railroad authority couldn't overcome. Jake held legitimate ownership of surface rights, which meant legitimate ownership of whatever lay beneath, which meant the Riverside Railroad Company's scheme had just become exponentially more expensive to execute. "This doesn't end here," Hayes said through gritted teeth, his mask of civilized authority finally slipping completely. "I'll be back with a federal railroad inspector and enough men to settle this matter permanently. Mr. Miller, you're interfering with interstate commerce and railroad expansion authorized by Congress itself. Mrs. Barnes, your debt remains valid regardless of property ownership, and the child will fulfill her family's obligations one way or another. Jake felt the weight of the confrontation's true scope settling on his shoulders. This wasn't just about a sick child and her desperate grandmother anymore. It was about a conspiracy that reached into territorial government, involved federal authority, and commanded enough resources to forge documents and deploy armed men across multiple counties. His deed might grant him legal ownership, but legal ownership meant nothing against people willing to use violence to get what they wanted. "When you come back," Jake said quietly, "bring all the documentation you claim to have. Bring the federal inspector. Bring your army of hired guns. Bring whatever authority you think gives you the right to steal from families and exploit children. But understand this, you'll have to go through me to get to them, and I guarantee that won't be as easy as you think." Hayes remounted his horse with jerky, angry movements, his hired men following suit with the reluctance of professionals who recognized they'd been outmaneuvered tactically, if not strategically. 3 days, Mr. Miller. 3 days to reconsider your position and accept our generous offer. After that, this becomes a federal matter, and federal matters don't end with negotiations. As the riders disappeared back into the canyon, Jake realized that his $150 investment had just escalated into something that would either make him rich beyond imagination or get him killed trying to protect a family he'd known for less than a week. The survey map in his hands proved that Copper Ridge held enough silver to transform the entire territory, but it also proved that people with vast resources and questionable morals would stop at nothing to claim that wealth for themselves. 2 days after Hayes' departure, Jake was splitting firewood behind the assay office when the sound of approaching wagons echoed up from the canyon floor. This time, however, the approaching travelers moved with the slow, careful pace of families rather than the predatory efficiency of hired guns. Lucy emerged from the building with her shotgun, but her posture suggested caution rather than immediate alarm as a convoy of 3 covered wagons wound its way up the narrow trail toward their hidden sanctuary. The lead wagon was driven by a woman whose bearing immediately commanded respect. Tall, with prematurely silver hair braided back from a face that spoke of hard decisions made and harder consequences endured. She brought her team to a halt just outside shotgun range and called out with the clear voice of someone accustomed to being heard and heeded. "Mrs. Barnes, my name is Beth Parker, and I believe we have common enemies," the woman announced, remaining seated but keeping her hands visible on the wagon's brake lever. "I'm traveling with 19 other families who've lost their homes to the same railroad lies that drove you from yours. We're hoping you might have room for allies in whatever fight is coming." Lucy lowered her weapon as the full scope of Beth's convoy became apparent. Men, women, and children emerged from the wagons with the careful movements of people who'd learned to expect trouble, but hadn't yet given up hope of finding sanctuary. Their belongings spoke of hasty departures, essential tools, precious keepsakes, and the kind of practical supplies that families gathered when they knew they might not see home again for a very long time. Jake approached Beth's wagon as she climbed down, noting the way she automatically scanned the terrain with the practiced eye of someone who'd learned to think tactically about survival. 19 families, he said, making it half question and half statement. "How many homesteads has this railroad company stolen?" 23 that we know of, stretching from here clear down to the Sweetwater Valley, Beth replied grimly. "All the same pattern. Fraudulent debt claims, forged documents, threats against anyone who resists. But you're the first property owner we've found who actually fought back instead of running." She gestured toward the other families, who were beginning to make camp with the efficient movements of people who'd done this many times before. So most folks didn't have the luxury of a defensible position or the legal documentation to challenge the railroad's claims. Lucy approached with Lily leaning heavily against her side, the child's pale face brightening slightly at the sight of other children among the displaced families. "How did you find us?" Lucy asked, though her tone suggested relief rather than suspicion. "We've been careful to stay hidden. Michael Foster found us," Beth said, her voice carrying a complex mixture of gratitude and wariness. He's the territorial surveyor who's been creating the forged documents for the railroad company, but something changed his mind about the work he was doing. 3 weeks ago, he approached our group with information about the conspiracy and proof of how extensive it really is. Jake felt his pulse quicken at the mention of the name he'd seen on the hidden survey map. Where is Foster now? If he's got evidence that could expose this whole operation, Beth's expression darkened. That's the problem. Foster was supposed to meet us here 2 days ago with documentation that could bring down the entire Riverside Railroad conspiracy. When he didn't arrive, we sent scouts back along his planned route. They found signs of a struggle and evidence that multiple riders had forced Foster off the main trail. She paused, studying Jake's face carefully. We think Deputy Hayes has him, which means whatever evidence Foster gathered might already be destroyed. A commotion from the edge of camp drew their attention as one of Beth's scouts rode in hard, his horse lathered with sweat and his face grim with urgent news. "Beth, we've got company coming up the main trail," he called out. "Not Hayes and his guns. Looks like newspaper men and maybe some territorial officials. Word's getting out about what's happening here." Within the hour, their hidden sanctuary had transformed into something resembling a frontier town meeting, with displaced families, curious reporters, and suspicious territorial investigators all converging on the narrow canyon that had served as refuge for the Barnes family. Jake found himself in the unexpected position of hosting representatives from 3 different newspapers: a territorial marshal who claimed to be investigating railroad corruption, and a delegation of Shoshone elders whose presence puzzled everyone until Beth explained their connection to the larger conspiracy. "The railroad company hasn't just been stealing homesteads," Beth revealed as the various groups gathered around a central fire that evening. "Foster told us they've been using information stolen from Native American sacred sites, places where tribes have traditional knowledge about mineral deposits. The survey work that's driving all these land grabs is based on generations of indigenous geological knowledge that the railroad acquired through bribery, theft, and worse." Elder Joseph Crow Feather stepped forward, his weathered face grave with the weight of violated trust. "My people have known the location of silver veins in this territory for countless generations," he said, his accented English carrying the formal cadence of someone choosing words carefully. "We shared this knowledge with early settlers in the spirit of friendship, never imagining it would be used to justify stealing land from the same families we sought to help." Jake felt the pieces of the conspiracy clicking into place with sickening clarity. The railroad company hadn't just been opportunistically grabbing valuable land. They'd been conducting a systematic campaign of theft based on traditional Native American knowledge, using that information to identify the most valuable properties before manufacturing reasons to seize them. The scope of the operation was staggering, involving corruption at multiple levels of government and the exploitation of both indigenous wisdom and settler families. As if summoned by the revelation of the conspiracy's true scope, Lily emerged from the assay office supported by her grandmother, her young face alight with an energy Jake hadn't seen since his arrival. The child approached Elder Crow Feather with the careful respect of someone recognizing a kindred spirit, and when she spoke, her voice carried a clarity that cut through all the adult complications surrounding her situation. "The silver isn't just in the ground," Lily said quietly, her green eyes fixed on the elder's weathered face. "It's connected to something deeper. Water sources, sacred places, the places where your people knew the earth held power. That's why it hurts me so much to sense it here. I'm not just finding metal, I'm finding stolen knowledge." Lily's words proved prophetic in the worst possible way. That night, as the temperature dropped and the silver veins beneath the camp seemed to pulse with increased intensity, the child's condition took a turn that terrified everyone who witnessed it. Jake was awakened by Lucy's desperate cries for help, and he rushed into the assay office to find Lily convulsing on her cot, her small body rigid with seizures that seemed to coincide with some invisible rhythm only she could perceive. "It's getting stronger," Lucy whispered through tears, trying to hold her granddaughter steady without restraining her too tightly. "Started just after midnight, like something changed in the ground beneath us. She keeps saying the silver is singing too loud. that it's calling to something deep in the earth that shouldn't be disturbed. Elder Crow Feather appeared in the doorway, his weathered face grave with recognition of something the rest of them couldn't yet understand. Beth Parker organized the displaced families to maintain watch, while Jake and several of the men tried to figure out what had triggered Lily's crisis. The answer came with the thundering approach of horses just before dawn, Hayes and his hired guns returning with twice as many riders as before, their arrival coinciding with an immediate worsening of Lily's condition that suggested her supernatural sensitivity was responding to more than just the silver deposits. "Foster's dead," Hayes announced without preamble as his enlarged force surrounded the camp, his voice carrying the flat satisfaction of a man delivering news he'd been anticipating. "Killed Federal Inspector Morrison in cold blood when the inspector discovered Foster's forgery operation. I'm here with a federal warrant to arrest Foster's known associates and secure evidence of his crimes against interstate commerce." But Jake noticed something wrong with Hayes's story immediately. The deputy's clothes were travel-stained and his horse was exhausted, but his men looked fresh and well-rested, as if they'd been waiting nearby rather than riding hard from some distant confrontation. More telling was the way Hayes kept glancing toward the assay office, his attention divided between maintaining his official facade and monitoring something that clearly concerned him more than the group of displaced families. The truth emerged when one of Beth's scouts appeared from the canyon's upper reaches, supporting a bloodied but very much alive Michael Foster, who clutched a leather satchel to his chest, like his life depended on its contents. "Foster saved Inspector Morrison," the scout called out as they approached the camp. "Railroad assassins tried to kill them both when Morrison started asking too many questions about the fraudulent documents. Foster's got evidence that goes all the way to the territorial capital." Foster himself looked like a man who'd stared into the abyss and decided to fight back rather than fall in. His surveyor's clothes were torn and stained with blood from a bullet wound in his left shoulder, but his eyes burned with the fierce determination of someone who'd found his conscience at exactly the right moment. "The conspiracy involves the Territorial Land Office, 3 federal judges, and railroad interests stretching from here to San Francisco," he announced, his voice carrying despite his obvious pain. "I've got documentation proving systematic theft of indigenous knowledge, forged government contracts, and murder orders signed by company officials." Hayes's mask finally slipped completely as he realized his carefully constructed narrative had just collapsed. "Kill them all," he snarled to his men, abandoning any pretense of legal authority. "Burn the evidence and make it look like a dispute over mining claims. The railroad will cover any investigation." But as Hayes's hired guns began to spread out for what was clearly intended to be a massacre, Lily's seizures reached a crescendo that seemed to crack something fundamental in the ground beneath the camp. Elder Crow Feather suddenly straightened with understanding, his weathered hands pointing toward a section of the canyon wall where ancient petroglyphs were barely visible beneath decades of weathering. "The child isn't sick from the silver," the elder said urgently, his voice cutting through the chaos of approaching violence. "She's responding to the sacred spring hidden beneath this place. Her gift is trying to connect her to healing waters that my people sealed away generations ago to protect them from those who would misuse their power." He approached the canyon wall with swift, sure movements despite his age, pressing his hands against specific symbols carved into the rock face. The wall responded to his touch with a grinding sound that spoke of mechanisms older than any mining operation, revealing a narrow entrance to chambers that had been hidden since before the first European explorers reached the territory. Jake felt something shift in his understanding as he realized that Lily's supernatural sensitivity hadn't been finding just silver deposits. She'd been detecting the spiritual energy of a sacred site that the railroad's exploitation had awakened to dangerous levels. Foster struggled to his feet despite his wounds, understanding the implications immediately. "The survey map I created," he said breathlessly. "It was based on tribal knowledge, but I never realized I was mapping sacred sites rather than just mineral deposits. The railroad has been systematically desecrating holy places to steal their resources, He looked toward the hidden entrance with dawning comprehension. If there's a healing spring down there, it might be the only thing that can help the child. Hayes and his men found themselves facing not just armed resistance from the displaced families, but the moral weight of preparing to commit massacre at a site that had been sacred for centuries before their railroad company ever existed. Some of the hired guns began to hesitate, recognizing that they'd crossed a line from simple violence into something that would haunt them regardless of how much they were being paid. Jake made his decision as Lily's convulsions reached an intensity that suggested she might not survive much longer without intervention. "Lucy, bring her," he called out, drawing his gun and moving toward the hidden entrance. "Elder Crow Feather, lead us to the spring. Everyone else, hold this position and don't let Hayes follow us into the sacred chambers." As gunfire erupted behind them, Jake carried the unconscious child into passages carved from living rock by people who understood the connection between spiritual power and physical healing, praying that whatever lay hidden in the depths beneath Copper Ridge could save a little girl whose gift had made her both blessed and cursed by forces beyond anyone's control. The sacred chambers beneath Copper Ridge held wonders that Jake's practical mind struggled to accept, but Lily's desperate condition left no room for skepticism about what couldn't be explained through conventional understanding. Elder Crow Feather led them through passages that glowed with their own inner light, past walls carved with symbols that seemed to shift and dance in peripheral vision, toward the sound of running water that grew stronger with each step they took deeper into the earth. The healing spring emerged from the canyon's heart, like something from a fever dream, a pool of crystalline water that reflected light that had no visible source, surrounded by formations of silver and quartz that hummed with harmonies only Lily seemed able to hear clearly. As soon as Jake lowered the child near the water's edge, her convulsions began to ease, and for the first time in days, her breathing settled into a natural rhythm that spoke of genuine rest rather than unconscious exhaustion. Lucy knelt beside her granddaughter with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks, her hands shaking as she helped Lily drink small sips of the spring water that tasted like mountain snow and summer rain combined. "The pain is leaving," Lily whispered, her green eyes focusing with clarity that had been absent for weeks. "The silver isn't screaming anymore. It's singing the way it's supposed to, the way it did before people started hurting the earth to reach it." Behind them, footsteps echoed in the passage as an unexpected figure emerged from the shadows. Hayes approached slowly, his hands raised and empty, his face showing a transformation that spoke of a man who'd seen something that shattered his previous certainties about right and wrong. "My men turned on me when they realized what we were really doing here," he said quietly, his voice stripped of all its former arrogance. "Shooting at families is one thing, but desecrating sacred sites for railroad money, that's something else entirely." Elder Crow Feather studied Hayes with the patient attention of someone reading a man's soul through his actions rather than his words. "The spring shows truth to those willing to see it," the elder said finally. "Your spirit recognizes the difference between law and justice, between authority and righteousness. The question is what you choose to do with that recognition." Jake found himself in the surreal position of accepting Hayes's help as they worked together to understand how the healing spring could transform Lily's supernatural gift from burden into blessing. The water didn't eliminate her sensitivity to precious metals, but it cleansed her ability of the pain and exploitation that had made it a curse. More importantly, Elder Crow Feather revealed that traditional knowledge spoke of individuals like Lily, whose gifts could be redirected toward life-sustaining purposes rather than destructive extraction. 3 days later, Lily demonstrated her transformed abilities by locating a clean water source that allowed the displaced families to establish permanent settlement in the canyon, turning their temporary refuge into the foundation of a community that would honor both the land's mineral wealth and its spiritual significance. Jake watched in amazement as the child who'd once suffered from detecting silver now guided settlers to underground streams that could support farms, gardens, and the kind of sustainable development that built communities rather than destroying them. 6 months after Deputy Hayes had first arrived with fraudulent documents and hired guns, the former mining camp had become Cedar Falls, a thriving settlement where Jake's legal ownership of mineral rights had been transformed into shared prosperity for all the families the Riverside Railroad had tried to rob. Foster's testimony before federal investigators had exposed the conspiracy from territorial offices to San Francisco boardrooms, resulting in arrests, congressional hearings, and the complete dissolution of the railroad company that had orchestrated so much suffering. Hayes himself had undergone the most dramatic transformation of anyone involved in the crisis. The man who'd once threatened to drag families into labor camps now served as Cedar Falls's elected sheriff, his knowledge of railroad tactics making him uniquely qualified to protect the settlement from similar threats. His badge was real now, backed by territorial authority and community trust, earned through actions rather than claimed through intimidation. Jake stood on the porch of the expanded assay office, now serving as both his home and the settlement's unofficial town hall, watching as Lily helped a new family locate water for their homestead claim. The child had grown taller and stronger over the winter months, her gift no longer a source of pain, but a vital tool for building the kind of community where families could prosper without fear of exploitation by distant corporate interests. Lucy emerged from the building behind him, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the kind of peaceful expression that came from watching a grandchild thrive rather than merely survive. "She wants to help survey the new school site this afternoon," Lucy said, settling beside Jake on the bench he'd built facing the canyon's entrance. "Says she can find the best spot where the water runs closest to the surface, but the silver veins won't interfere with the foundation." Jake accepted the coffee gratefully, thinking about how his $150 investment had transformed into something he could never have anticipated when he'd first ridden up the canyon looking for abandoned mining claims. Cedar Falls now housed 43 families, supported 3 working mines that shared profits among all residents, and had attracted teachers, craftsmen, and merchants who recognized the opportunity to build something lasting in a place where justice had replaced exploitation. Beth Parker approached from the settlement's main street, her arms full of mail from the territorial capital, and her expression bright with the satisfaction of someone who'd helped turn defeat into victory. "Foster sends his regards from the new territorial surveyor's office," she announced, handing Jake an official-looking document. "The federal government has formally recognized Cedar Falls's mineral claims and granted us township status. We're legitimate now, in every sense of the word." As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the thriving community that had grown from the ruins of corporate greed, Jake reflected on how Lily's transformation from victim to valuable community member represented something larger than any individual story of healing and redemption. Cedar Falls had become proof that families could resist exploitation when they stood together, that traditional knowledge deserved respect rather than theft, and that children with special gifts flourished when protected by communities rather than exploited by corporations. The sound of Lily's laughter echoed across the settlement as she guided another family toward water sources that would sustain their dreams of building a life in the American West. And Jake understood that his greatest treasure hadn't been the silver beneath the ground, but the family he'd found living among the ruins and the community they'd all built together from the ashes of other people's greed.